Have you lost your mind? Let me go! The scream echoed through St. Patrick's Cathedral. 500 of Chicago's most powerful people watched in shock. A maid, her uniform stained and her hair wild, had grabbed the groom's wrist and was dragging him down the aisle. The bride screamed for security. Guards closed in like wolves, but the maid did not let go. Her green eyes burned with tears as she whispered, "You are in danger. Please, just listen to me for 1 minute." Nico Fontaine, one of the most feared men in Chicago, looked into her eyes and saw something that stopped him cold. It was not madness. It was real fear. He raised his hand and stopped the guards. Then he followed her, behind a closed door. 500 guests held their breath. The bride stood alone, trembling. No one knew that in the next few minutes, an entire empire would be shattered forever. This is a story about a woman who had nothing but her courage, and a man who had everything but the truth. If you have ever been underestimated or silenced, this story is for you. If you want to find out who this woman is and what secret she revealed behind that door, please like this video. Share it with your friends who love drama, and hit subscribe so you never miss another episode. It all started 48 hours earlier, with the sound of a teacup breaking. 2 days before the wedding, the Fontaine estate was quiet. It sat on the edge of Chicago like an ancient castle, with gray stone walls and stained glass windows. A marble fountain stood in the middle of a perfect garden. Everything about the place spoke of a wealth most people could only imagine, but hidden behind all that beauty were secrets that no light could touch. The sound of breaking china suddenly tore through the silence. A valuable antique teacup had shattered into pieces. Hot tea spilled across the marble floor. It stained a Persian rug that was 100 years old and pooled near a pair of bright red high heels. Audrey Shaw stood perfectly still. She was 28 years old, with her brown hair tied back neatly. Her green eyes looked tired and her skin was pale from not getting enough sleep. After 8 months working as a maid for the Fontaines, she knew how cruel the rich could be. But she had never experienced anything like this. She still held the empty silver tray. She had not dropped the cup. Veronica Sterling, Nico's fiancée, had knocked it over on purpose. With a small, practiced move of her hand, Veronica stood up from the sofa. Her designer dress fit her perfectly. Her beautiful face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. But Audrey could see the truth. Behind Veronica's icy blue eyes was not anger, but pure satisfaction. It was the look of someone who loved to crush other people. "You filthy maid!" Veronica screamed. Her voice echoed in the huge room. "Do you know what these shoes cost? It is more than you make in a whole year. How will you ever pay me back? With that skinny body of yours?" Audrey looked down. She pressed her lips together so hard they started to bleed. She wanted to say that it was not her fault. She wanted to tell the truth, that Veronica had done it. But who would believe a servant? In the corner, Mrs. Patterson, the head housekeeper, stood like a statue. She had worked for the Fontaines for over 30 years. She had seen everything. She knew Veronica was lying, but the housekeeper just lowered her head and looked away. She did not dare to say a word. In this house, Veronica Sterling had almost total power. She would soon be the lady of the manor. No one would dare to cross her. "Kneel," Veronica said. Her voice was cold and sharp. "Clean my shoes with your hands. Use the white cloth from your apron." Audrey looked up, her green eyes wide with shock. But Veronica's cold, hateful stare did not change. Slowly, Audrey got down on her knees. The warm tea soaked through her uniform, and sharp pieces of the broken cup cut into her skin. She took out the white cloth and began to clean the red shoes. Then, a sudden kick to her shoulder almost made her fall over. It was the sharp heel of Veronica's shoe. "Scrub harder," Veronica hissed, her voice full of sick pleasure. and keep your cheap, poor person smell off my things. You are worth less than my fingernail." Audrey swallowed her shame and held back her tears. She thought about Tommy, her 16-year-old brother, who was sick in a hospital bed. He had a heart problem he was born with. The doctors told her the surgery to save him would cost $200,000. It was an impossible amount of money. This job was all she had. If she lost it, Tommy would not survive. She had to keep this job, even if it meant kneeling here and being treated this way. Silent tears fell from her eyes, mixing with the cooling tea on the floor. She knew this was only the start of her nightmare. Heavy footsteps came from the hall. They were strong and steady, like the beat of a heart that had turned to stone. Audrey was still on the floor. The white cloth was now brown with tea, and her knees were bleeding from the broken china. When she heard the footsteps, her own heart froze. Nico Fontaine entered the room. He was 36 years old and stood 185 centimeters tall. He wore a perfect black suit and looked like he belonged on the cover of a magazine. His face was handsome and sharp, but his gray eyes made people afraid. They were cold and distant and held a deep sadness that nobody could understand. He was the leader of the Fontaine family, one of the most powerful groups in Chicago. In the city's hidden world, the name Nico Fontaine was law. Nobody questioned him, nobody betrayed him, and nobody looked him in the eye for too long. Nico's gaze took in the entire scene. His fiancée stood there, looking angry. The maid was on her knees in a mess of tea and broken glass. The expensive rug was ruined. He had no time to figure out what was happening. Then something strange occurred. Veronica Sterling, who had just been screaming like a monster, suddenly changed. She became a fragile, helpless victim. She ran to Nico, her heels clicking on the floor. She grabbed his arm and leaned against his chest. Her blue eyes filled with tears and her lips began to tremble, as if she were the one who had been hurt. Veronica's voice became sickly sweet. "Nico, my love?" She lied, saying, "I ruined the shoes you gave me." She called it a bad sign for your wedding tomorrow. Audrey knelt on the floor, silenced by the performance. She wanted to scream that it was a lie, but the words would not come. Nico looked down at the maid at his feet. His gray gaze was empty, as if she were an object. He asked no questions. He sought no truth. He was simply tired. Tomorrow, he would marry again. He would finally bury the memory of Kate, his first wife, who died 2 years before from a heart condition. Nico wanted only quiet. He had no time for problems. "Get out," he said. His voice was cold and final. "Do not cause more trouble. Be careful next time, or you will be fired." He turned away without another look. Veronica held his arm as they walked upstairs, leaving Audrey on the floor. It felt like a knife in Audrey's chest. Veronica's cruelty was painful, but Nico's complete indifference hurt so much more. He did not torment her. He simply did not see her. She was invisible air to him. To be ignored was worse than being hated. It made you feel like you were nothing at all. "Yes, Mr. Fontaine," Audrey whispered. She forced herself to stand, her knees shaking. Blood from the broken porcelain seeped through her black uniform. She picked up the tray, kept her head low, and walked out of the room. She would not let them see her cry. The humiliation burned inside her, but she had to endure it for Tommy. His surgery cost $200,000. She could not afford to lose this job. She did not know that her life was about to be caught in a terrible storm. Audrey walked down the long, hollow corridor, her legs heavy as lead. The eyes in the old paintings seemed to judge her. She had to be strong for Tommy. As she neared the library, she paused. The heavy door was slightly open. A familiar voice came from inside. It was Veronica Sterling. But this voice was not sweet. It was cold, vicious, and full of triumph. It made her skin crawl. Audrey knew listening was forbidden. If she were caught, she would be fired immediately. But an instinct she could not control made her stay. She hid in a dark corner, her back against the cold wall, and listened. "He is still a fool for me," Veronica said with disgust. "That old man is pathetic. He just drowns in memories of his dead wife." Audrey stopped breathing. Was Veronica calling Nico Fontaine an old man? The man she called her love just moments ago. "Do not worry, baby," Veronica continued. "After the honeymoon, he will have the same fate as Kate. Then no one will be in our way." Audrey's heart felt like it was being crushed, just like Kate. Nico's first wife died from a sudden heart attack 2 years ago. The entire city of Chicago knew the tragic story. "The inheritance papers are ready," Veronica said with satisfaction. "My lawyer has it all prepared. I just need his signature tonight. He trusts me without question." A chilling laugh followed. "Do not worry. I have the medicine. This new kind leaves no trace." "An autopsy will find nothing," Veronica explained. "A few more doses and he will sleep forever, just like his poor wife did." Audrey felt sick. Kate Fontaine did not die from a heart attack. She was murdered, and Veronica Sterling was her killer. Then, "Baby, you will have everything," Veronica whispered to her lover. "The Fontaine empire will be ours, all the money and the power. We just need to be patient. After the wedding, I will handle it." Who would ever suspect a young widow grieving for her husband? Her sharp laughter filled the air again. Audrey trembled uncontrollably. The woman whose shoes she just cleaned was a monster. She had killed Kate Fontaine. Now she was planning to kill Nico Fontaine. The man who had just dismissed her was going to die. He was sleeping beside his enemy, believing it was love. Suddenly, Audrey heard the click of high heels. Veronica was walking to the door. Panic seized her. If Veronica found her, she would die. She knew too much. Audrey turned and ran for the kitchen. Her heart pounded in her chest. She slipped on the marble floor, her knee hitting the ground with a sharp pain. But she scrambled up and kept running. The dark hall seemed endless. The kitchen door finally appeared. She threw herself inside and slammed it shut. She leaned against the wall, gasping for air. Her whole body shook. The words twisted in her mind. Kate had been murdered. Nico was next to die. And she, a simple maid, was the only one who knew the truth. Who could she tell? Who would believe her? She stumbled forward and almost collided with someone. It was Maggie Torres, her closest coworker at the mansion. Maggie was 35, a kind Hispanic woman. "Audrey, what happened?" Maggie cried out, her brown eyes wide with alarm. "Your face is white as a sheet. You look like you saw a ghost." Audrey could not speak. She grabbed Maggie's arm and pulled her to the darkest corner of the huge kitchen. She dragged her behind tall shelves, far from the doorway. Maggie followed, her face a mix of confusion and fear. Once they were hidden, Audrey looked at her, her eyes still filled with terror. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "Maggie, I heard something awful. Veronica, she was talking to someone." Audrey told her everything. She explained how Veronica called Nico an idiot. She described the murder of Kate. She repeated the plan for a poison that leaves no trace. She told her about the plot to steal the Fontaine empire. Maggie stood like a statue, frozen in horror. Maggie quickly covered Audrey's mouth with her hand. "Are you crazy?" she hissed. "Be quiet. If anyone hears us, we are both dead." Maggie's eyes darted around nervously. "Are you sure? You heard everything clearly? You did not misunderstand?" "I heard it all, Maggie," Audrey insisted, her voice full of desperation. "She has the medicine. She will do it after the honeymoon. Maggie, she is a devil. She killed Mrs. Kate, and now she is going to kill the boss." Maggie trembled, leaning on the shelves as if she could not stand. "What do we do?" she whispered. Who would ever believe us? Her eyes were filled with helplessness. We are just maids, Audrey. This is the Fontaine family, the most powerful mafia in Chicago. If we accuse her and are wrong, we die. If we are right and cannot prove it, we still die. Die. Do you get it? Audrey got it. She understood with perfect clarity. The world was not fair. A maid's testimony was meaningless against the word of a beautiful socialite who would soon be in charge. Then came a sound from outside the kitchen, the sharp click of high heels. Steady, precise, coming right for them. Audrey and Maggie went completely still. The blood froze in their veins. They knew exactly who it was. Both women scrambled behind a tall shelf, trying to make themselves invisible. The kitchen door swung open. Veronica Sterling entered, dressed in her brilliant turquoise Valentino gown. She walked to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottle of mineral water. After a single sip, she paused. Her cold blue eyes scanned the room, as if she could feel their presence. Audrey stopped breathing. Her heart was pounding so loudly she was certain Veronica could hear it. Maggie trembled beside her, both hands pressed against her mouth to silence any sound. 1 second passed, then 2, then 3. Time seemed to stretch into an eternity. Finally, Veronica just shrugged, placed the bottle on the counter, and left. The sound of her footsteps grew fainter until they vanished entirely. Audrey and Maggie let out their breath in a shared rush of relief, their muscles aching from the strain. Maggie grabbed Audrey's hand, her voice a low, determined whisper. We have to get proof, Audrey. Real proof. Without it, our words mean nothing. You cannot convict someone like Veronica Sterling on words alone. Do you see? Audrey nodded. She saw. But where could they possibly find it? And who would ever dare to help them? Later that night, the Fontaine mansion fell into a deep, unnerving quiet. In the basement servants' quarters, Audrey lay on her small bed, staring at the dark ceiling. The words she overheard that afternoon played over and over in her mind. A medicine that leaves no evidence, a permanent sleep. Just like what happened to Kate. She tossed and turned, but rest would not come. Finally, she gave up and rose from the bed. A quiet walk might help clear her head. Audrey put on a light sweater, eased her door open, and slipped out. The Fontaine estate had a haunted quality at night, so different from its daytime appearance. Dim lamps lit the long hallways, throwing distorted shadows on the walls. Her bare feet made little sound on the cold stone floors. As she passed through the main hall, Audrey froze. A small figure with frost-white hair was standing perfectly still in front of a large painting. It was Mrs. Patterson, the housekeeper who had served the Fontaine family for more than 30 years, the woman who had seen everything that afternoon and said absolutely nothing. Audrey began to back away, but a strong sense of curiosity held her in place. She had to know what Mrs. Patterson was staring at. Moving closer, she saw it was the portrait of a young woman. Her hair was the color of wheat, her eyes a gentle blue. A warm smile on her face seemed to brighten the entire painting. It was Kate Fontaine, Nico Fontaine's deceased wife, the woman Veronica Sterling had murdered. You heard them too, did you not, child? Mrs. Patterson's voice startled Audrey. The older woman did not turn, her eyes remaining on the portrait. I saw you run down the hall earlier today. I saw the terror in your eyes. You overheard, Miss Veronica, didn't you? Audrey was paralyzed, unsure what to say. A lie could be dangerous. The truth could be fatal. But Mrs. Patterson did not press for an answer. She let out a long sigh, heavy with years of sorrow. I know, child. I have known for a very long time what Veronica is capable of, what she did to Mrs. Kate, and what she is planning to do next. She finally turned, her old eyes sharp and clear as she looked directly at Audrey. Before she passed, Mrs. Kate was suspicious. She told me she always felt sick after taking the supplements from Dr. Harris, the private family doctor. She felt tired, dizzy, and her heart would race. But the doctor always told her she was just overworked. Mrs. Patterson looked back at the painting, her expression a mix of love and sadness. She was a very bright woman, child. She knew something was wrong. She wrote a letter detailing all of her fears and hid it. She told me if anything were to happen to her, I needed to find the antique music box. It was the wedding gift Mr. Nico gave her. A music box? Audrey asked, her voice just above a whisper. Mrs. Patterson nodded. An old one, made of wood and carved with roses. Mr. Nico had a craftsman in Italy make it just for Mrs. Kate. It plays Claire de Lune. It was Mrs. Kate's favorite song, the one they shared their first dance to at their wedding. She sighed once more. After Mrs. Kate passed away, Mr. Nico moved all of her things into a storage room on the 3rd floor. He ordered that no one was ever to touch them. The music box is in that room. Mrs. Patterson reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished brass key. She pressed it into Audrey's hand. I have held on to this key for 2 years. 2 years of being silent and afraid. I am too old now, child. I am too old and too frightened to act. She looked at Audrey, a flicker of hope in her gaze. But you? There is still a fire inside you. I saw it when you cleaned Veronica's shoes without shedding a tear. I saw it when you ran down that hallway with purpose, not just fear. You have what I have lost, child. You have courage. Audrey looked at the small key in her palm. Her heart was beating wildly. This was a real clue. This could be the evidence she and Maggie desperately needed, but it was also a path that could lead directly to her own death. That storage room was off limits. The Fontaines were not known for their forgiveness. If they caught her, she would not just be fired. She would disappear. Then she thought of Nico Fontaine, the man with endless sadness in his gray eyes. The man whose wife had been murdered without his knowledge. The man who was now the next target of someone he trusted. He was a cold and distant man. He had not defended her, but he did not deserve to die. Nobody deserved to die that way. I will find it, Audrey declared, her voice shaking but firm with new resolve. I have to find it. At 2 a.m, the Fontaine mansion was submerged in a terrifying silence. The only sounds were the wind whispering outside and the frantic pounding of Audrey's own heart. She stood at the bottom of the staircase that led to the 3rd floor. The old brass key was a cold weight in her sweaty hand. This was forbidden ground. Since Kate Fontaine's death, no one was allowed up there. It was Nico Fontaine's direct order. Breaking that rule was a death sentence. Audrey took a shaky breath, trying to calm her nerves. She thought of Tommy in his hospital bed. She thought of Mrs. Patterson's hopeful eyes. She thought of Kate Fontaine, a woman murdered in secret, her truth buried with her. She began to climb the stairs, one slow, careful step at a time. A cold sweat dripped down her face. Every groan of the old wood made her heart jump into her throat. The darkness felt heavy, like a thick blanket smothering her. Finally, she reached the 3rd floor. The hallway here was even darker than the rest of the house. There were no lamps. A thick coat of dust covered the floor, proof that no one had walked here in a very long time. Audrey turned on the small flashlight on her phone, its pale beam cutting across the ancient walls. At the far end of the hall was the door to Kate's storage room. It was made of heavy oak with an old, intricate design. Audrey moved toward it, slid the key into the lock, and twisted. The loud scrape of metal against wood echoed through the night, making her jump. She pushed the door open, slipped inside, and immediately closed it behind her. The room was like a different world, one completely frozen in time. Dust was everywhere, so thick that tiny particles danced in the beam of her light. Furniture was covered in white sheets, standing like silent ghosts, guarding the memories of the deceased. Audrey's light drifted across the room and landed on a wedding photo on the wall. Kate Fontaine was in a brilliant white dress, her blonde hair flowing over her shoulders, her blue eyes bright with joy. Next to her stood Nico Fontaine, but he was not the man Audrey knew. The man in the picture was smiling. It was a warm and genuine smile, filled with pure love. His gray eyes were not cold, but alive with happiness. They looked at one another as if nothing else in the world existed. Audrey felt a sharp pain in her chest. This was the real Nico Fontaine. This was him before sorrow consumed him, before Veronica Sterling took the life of the woman he loved. She fought back tears and forced herself to concentrate. She did not have much time. Audrey started her search. A closet was filled with beautiful dresses that still carried a hint of a soft perfume. The drawers of a vanity were full of sparkling jewelry. A bookshelf held romance novels with folded page corners, but there was no music box. She checked under the table, behind the drapes, and inside the bedside table. Nothing. Precious time was running out. Every moment she spent in here increased the danger. At last, Audrey got on her hands and knees to look under the bed. Her flashlight beam pierced a dark corner. And then she saw it. Model. A forgotten wooden chest sat covered in dust. With shaking hands, she pulled it into the light and opened the lid. It held old memories, photos, and love letters. Tucked in a corner, wrapped in red velvet, was a music box. Audrey lifted it carefully. It was an antique, carved with roses so detailed they looked real. The wood was dark with age, but still held a quiet elegance. She opened it. The soft, sad notes of Claire de Lune filled the silent night. The melody felt like tears from the dead, telling a story of a love that was cruelly destroyed. Then Audrey saw it. Under the velvet lining was a folded letter and a small silver flash drive. Her hands trembled so much she almost could not unfold the paper. She held it under her flashlight and started to read. My dearest Nico, if you are reading this, I am no longer with you. I am sorry I kept this from you. I was scared and I was not sure. Veronica is not the person she claims to be. I saw her with another man they call the Fox. I heard them planning something awful. Dr. Harris has been giving me medicine that makes me weaker each day. I am certain they are giving me poison. I recorded what I could on this drive. Please, my love, be safe. Do not let her hurt you too. I will love you always. Forever yours, Kate. Tears fell onto the page, smudging the ink of the dead woman's words. Audrey wept. She wept for Kate Fontaine, a woman who knew she would die but still thought only of her husband. She wept for Nico Fontaine, who lost the great love of his life and never knew why. And she wept for herself, a simple maid holding a secret that could ruin them all. She finally had proof. The letter and the drive were the weapons to expose Veronica Sterling. But she had to escape this room first. Audrey quickly folded the letter and put it in her inside pocket with the flash drive. Her heart was beating wildly. Her hands shook so hard she almost dropped the music box. She placed it back inside the chest, slid the chest under the bed, and stood up to go. In that exact moment, the lights turned on. The sudden brightness made Audrey shut her eyes. When she opened them, her heart stopped. Veronica Sterling was standing in the doorway. She leaned against the frame with a look of pure victory. She wore a silk robe the color of blood, and her blonde hair fell over her shoulders. Her icy blue eyes were fixed on Audrey. Well, look what we have here. Veronica's voice was slow and dangerous. A little mouse sneaking around where she does not belong. Audrey stumbled back, hitting the edge of the bed. She tried to hide her fear, but her heart was pounding loud enough for Veronica to hear. "Miss Veronica." Veronica walked into the room. Her heels clicked on the dusty floor. Her eyes moved from the chest under the bed to the disturbed dust on the floorboards, and then locked on Audrey's pale face. "What were you searching for, little mouse?" Veronica's voice became terrifyingly sweet. "Who gave you permission to enter this room? You know it is forbidden." Audrey struggled to speak, her voice shaking. I was lost. I could not sleep, so I went for a walk and took a wrong turn." Veronica laughed, a cold sound that cut through the silence. "Lost? At 2 in the morning? Lost inside a locked room on the 3rd floor? Do you think I am a fool?" She stepped closer, and each step felt like a threat. Soon she was standing right in front of Audrey, her cold eyes staring down in disgust. "What are you hiding?" Veronica's voice was sharp. Before Audrey could reply, she grabbed her by the collar and pulled her close. Veronica began searching the pockets of her apron. A hand with blood-red nails dug into every corner, looking for something. Audrey held her breath. The letter and the drive were in her inside pocket, not the apron. If Veronica just missed it. After a moment, Veronica found nothing. She pushed Audrey away, but her eyes were still narrow with anger and suspicion. "You are playing a game," Veronica hissed. "I do not know what it is, but I will discover it. You think you can trick me? A dirty little maid." Audrey stayed quiet and lowered her head. She understood that any word she said would only make things worse. Veronica stood over her cold eyes studying Audrey like prey. Then she smiled, a cruel smile that sent a shiver down Audrey's spine. "You know, I do not need to know what you were looking for." Veronica's voice was calm, which made it even more frightening. "I just need to get rid of you. You entered a forbidden space. That is reason enough for you to disappear from this house and from Chicago." She took a phone from her robe and dialed a number as casually as if she were ordering dinner. Audrey wanted to run, to grab the phone, to yell for help, but she was frozen. Any sudden movement would only confirm her guilt. "Nico, my love." Veronica's voice was suddenly sweet and fragile. The familiar act began again. "I am so sorry to wake you, but you must come to Kate's room. Something has happened. I found a little mouse sneaking around in here." She hung up and gave Audrey a triumphant look. "Now we wait, little mouse. Let us see how your boss handles this." Heavy footsteps grew louder on the stairs. Nico Fontaine appeared at the door. His handsome face was tight with exhaustion and anger from being woken up. He wore a rumpled white shirt, his black hair was a mess, and his gray eyes were tired. Behind him stood Finn O'Brien, his bodyguard, a large Irishman around 40 years old with a cold, expressionless face. Nico's eyes scanned the room and then settled on Audrey. The maid was trembling in the dusty room, her face white with terror. "You." Nico's voice was like ice. "You again? You dared to enter this room." Before Audrey could say a word, Veronica rushed to Nico's side like a frightened bird. She held onto his arm, her blue eyes looking red and tearful, her lips quivering with fake fear and pain. "Nico." Veronica's voice cracked with emotion. "I heard a noise, so I came to investigate. I found this girl going through Kate's things. She was searching for something. Nico, I think she was stealing." Audrey wanted to shout that it was a lie, but her throat was tight, and she could not make a sound. She watched Veronica's perfect performance and felt a wave of complete hopelessness. "Stealing." Nico's face grew harder, his voice full of disgust. "You would steal from my wife." "No, I did not," Audrey finally said. But Veronica spoke over her. "Check her pockets, Nico," Veronica suggested, her voice full of false worry. "Kate's diamond necklace, the one you gave her for your anniversary. It is missing from the jewelry box. See if she has it." Nico gave Finn a short nod. The bodyguard walked toward Audrey, his face cold and unfeeling. I am sorry, Finn said, and began to search her. Audrey stood perfectly still, her heart racing. The letter and the drive were in her inner pocket, safe beneath the fabric. If Finn just searched the apron, but then the unthinkable happened. As Finn checked her apron pocket, something shiny fell to the floor and made a sharp sound, a diamond necklace. Audrey stared at it, her eyes wide with shock. She had not taken it. She did not even know it was in the room, but there it was, from her pocket. Veronica. When Veronica searched her earlier, she was not looking for anything. She was planting the necklace. It was a trap, and Audrey had fallen right into it. I did not take it, Audrey yelled, her voice filled with desperation. I did not take it. She put it in my pocket. You have to believe me. But Nico was not listening. His gray eyes stared at Audrey with cold disappointment and anger. He bent down and picked up the necklace, his fingers brushing over the diamonds. It was as if he was touching a memory of his dead wife. I gave you a chance in this house. Nico's voice was low and heavy. Each word crushed Audrey. I forgave you for the tea incident. And this is my reward? You steal from my wife, and you break into a room I told you to stay out of. Mr. Fontaine, please just listen to me. Audrey pleaded, tears running down her face. I am not a thief. I came here to find something important. You are in danger. She pointed a shaking finger at Veronica. She is going to kill you, just like she killed Kate. A deep silence filled the room. Nico stood frozen. For a second, something shifted in his gray eyes. But Veronica broke the spell with a soft, pitying laugh. Poor girl, Veronica said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. She has lost her mind. She is inventing stories to avoid being punished. Nico, do not listen to her. She is just a pathetic thief. Nico looked away. He gave Audrey one final look before turning his back. His body stiffened, his fingers crushing the diamond necklace. Get her out of here. His voice was cold and empty. I want her blacklisted from this city. We do not employ traitors in this family. Finn nodded, stepping forward to grab Audrey's arm. She twisted and fought back. She tried to cry out one last warning. Please, you have to listen. Kate was poisoned. He is coming for you next. She left proof, but no one heard her. Finn hauled her from the room, down the grand staircase, and through the long, shadowed halls. Audrey screamed and begged, but her voice was useless. She was a maid. Her words carried no power in a world run by men like him. The iron gates of the estate swung open, then crashed shut behind her, the sound echoing in the night. Audrey was left in the dark at 3 a.m. with no money and no phone. There was nowhere for her to go. She had only her clothes and a heart heavy with despair. But then, she felt inside her pocket. The letter was still there. The USB was safe. Veronica might have won this battle, but the war was far from over. The Chicago wind sliced at Audrey's skin. She walked down an empty street, her cheap shoes soaked with dew. She was broke, alone, and had no shelter. But inside her coat, she protected Kate's letter and the small drive. It was the only proof that could save a man who was sleeping next to his enemy. For almost an hour, Audrey walked through the city's dark streets. She passed the glowing mansions of the rich and the crowded apartment blocks of the working class. She had only one destination in mind. It was Maggie Torres's small apartment. The building was run down, with cracked stairs and a smell of decay in the halls. Audrey climbed 4 flights, each step an agony for her aching legs. She knocked on the door. It was 4 a.m. when Maggie answered, wearing wrinkled pajamas, her dark hair a mess. Her eyes were clouded with sleep until she saw Audrey. Then she was wide awake. "Oh my God," Maggie gasped, pulling Audrey into the apartment. "What happened to you? You're as pale as a ghost and your lips are blue." Get inside now. Audrey collapsed onto an old sofa. Maggie wrapped her in a blanket and handed her hot tea. Audrey told her everything. She explained how she broke into Kate's room and found the music box with the letter. She described how Veronica caught her and framed her for stealing the necklace. She recounted Nico's freezing contempt as he ordered her thrown out into the night. When she finished, Maggie was silent, her face pale from the shock. "That witch," Maggie whispered, her voice full of anger. She planned the entire thing. Audrey nodded and took out the letter and the USB. "But I have the proof Kate left behind. We have to see what is on this drive." Maggie booted up her old laptop and inserted the USB. A folder appeared on the screen, full of files. The first one was a video, secretly recorded. It showed Veronica Sterling kissing a man Audrey did not recognize. He was tall, with dark hair and a long scar on his left cheek. They spoke in low voices, but it was clear this was not an innocent meeting. The next file was an audio clip. The Fontaine family doctor, Harris, was speaking. "We need to increase Mrs. Kate's dosage," he said. "She is getting suspicious. We have to speed this up." The rest of the files were photos. There were receipts for chemicals and screenshots of messages between Veronica and a man she called Baby. The messages said everything was on schedule, and soon they would have it all. Maggie's hands shook as she looked through the evidence. Her face had gone completely white. "This is real," she whispered. "Mrs. Kate was murdered. It was not a heart attack. Veronica poisoned her." "We have to call the police," Maggie said, her voice firm. Audrey just shook her head, her expression tired but certain. "We cannot. The Fontaines have the Chicago police in their pocket. They would bury this evidence so fast. Veronica would know we tried, and she would make sure we disappeared." "Then what do we do?" Maggie asked, her voice filled with despair. Audrey looked out the window as the black sky began to turn gray with the first light of morning. "The wedding was this afternoon, less than 12 hours from now. I have to get this proof to Nico myself," Audrey said, her voice surprisingly strong. "I will do it at the wedding today." Maggie looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "Are you crazy? You will never make it past the guards. They fired you. They know your face. They will stop you before you even get inside the church." "I know," Audrey replied, her green eyes burning with resolve. "But I have to try. It is his last chance. If I do nothing, Nico Fontaine will be next, and I cannot let that happen." Audrey did not sleep. She stayed on the sofa in Maggie's apartment, her eyes fixed on the laptop. She played the evidence Kate Fontaine gathered over and over. Each time, she saw a new detail, the smug smile on Veronica's face. She saw Veronica kissing the unknown man. She heard Dr. Harris's cold voice discussing the dosage. The messages spelled out the plan and their future together. Kate had known. She knew she was going to die and had tried to leave everything for her husband. But Nico never found her warning. Now, 2 years later, it was happening all over again. Audrey looked out the window at the black sky. She thought of her brother, Tommy, in the hospital, unaware his sister had been fired and framed. A 16-year-old boy with a fragile heart was waiting for surgery that could save him. $200,000. The number now felt more impossible than ever. If Audrey died, who would protect Tommy? Who would pay the hospital? But if she failed to act, Nico Fontaine would die, an innocent man. He would be killed by the woman he trusted completely, and Veronica Sterling, a murderer, would continue to live free, enjoying the power and wealth she had stolen with blood. Audrey stared at Maggie's phone. She had to hear Tommy's voice one last time. She dialed the hospital. After a few rings, Tommy answered, his voice weak but cheerful. "Audrey, hey, why are you calling so early? It is only 5 in the morning. Are you okay? You sound worn out." Audrey forced her voice to sound normal. "I am fine, sweetheart. I just finished a late shift. I wanted to hear your voice. You work too much, Tommy said with worry in his tone. Do not worry about me. The doctor says I get better every day. You have to eat properly, okay? Do not skip meals to save money for me. Silent tears rolled down Audrey's cheeks. She smiled, even knowing Tommy could not see it. You are being so good. I love you, Tommy. Always remember that. No matter what happens, I love you. What are you talking about? That is so strange. Tommy laughed. You sound like you are going on a long trip. I love you too. I will see you soon. Okay. Audrey's throat felt tight, her voice unsteady. Yes, I will see you soon. She hung up and let the tears fall. She cried for Tommy. She cried for herself. And she cried for the dangerous road ahead. Maggie sat beside her in silence, holding her hand. When the sun finally rose, Audrey stood. She put on the maid uniform Maggie kept for her and hid the music box with the letter and the USB in an inside pocket. Maggie stood by the door, her eyes red with worry. She pulled Audrey into a hug, her voice thick. Be careful. Please come. Back alive. I will be waiting. Audrey nodded and hugged Maggie back. I will try. She walked into the morning, the sunlight on her face. Before her was the road to St. Patrick's Cathedral, to the wedding of the century, and to a fate that would decide her life and Nico Fontaine's. St. Patrick's Cathedral stood in the center of Chicago, a timeless piece of Gothic art. Today it was decorated more lavishly than ever, with thousands of white flowers and shining silver ribbons. The wedding of Chicago's most powerful Mafia boss had captured the entire city's attention. Hundreds of luxury cars like Rolls-Royce and Bentley lined the street. Security was intense. Bodyguards in black suits were posted everywhere. Metal detectors were at each entrance, and the guest list was checked name by name. Audrey hid across the street behind a large tree, watching with a racing heart. She knew she could not use the main doors. Her face was known, her name blacklisted. If a guard spotted her, she would be captured instantly. She went around to the back of the cathedral to a service entrance for the staff. Catering trucks were parked there, with workers carrying food and drinks inside. At that moment, a middle-aged woman in a server's uniform hurried by, saw Audrey, and spoke sharply. Hey you, are you the new girl on the service team? Why are you just standing there? We are incredibly short on help. Get in here now, Audrey nodded, arranging her face into a neutral expression. Yes, I got confused. I did not know which door to use. Follow me. The woman grabbed Audrey's arm and pulled her into the kitchen. And with that, Audrey was inside the church. Her heart pounded like a drum, and a cold sweat formed on her forehead. The first step had succeeded, but it was only the beginning. Audrey made her way through the busy kitchen, trying to blend in with the catering staff. When she reached a side hallway, she froze. Finn O'Brien, Nico's most trusted bodyguard, was on patrol just ahead. Audrey slipped behind a thick stone pillar, holding her breath. Her heart was beating so hard she was afraid he might hear it. Finn walked past with even steps. Then he paused. Audrey did not breathe. Her entire body was stiff with fear. Finn's eyes swept the hallway as if he sensed something was off. 1 second passed, then 2, then 3. He finally shrugged and kept walking. Audrey let out a shaky breath, her legs trembling. But she had no time for fear. She had to continue. Audrey moved along the side hallway toward the cathedral's main hall. She could hear classical music playing inside, along with the murmur of hundreds of guests. She was close. Then the door in front of her opened. Audrey had no time to move before Veronica Sterling walked out. She was radiant in a pure white wedding gown, trailed by bridesmaids in pale pink. Audrey immediately turned her face away, pretending to wipe down a picture frame on the wall. Her heart stopped. If Veronica recognized her, everything was over. Veronica passed by, leaving a light scent of expensive perfume. She was laughing and talking with her bridesmaids, her voice full of joy. She did not look at Audrey. She did not recognize the maid she had fired the night before. When the footsteps faded, Audrey dared to breathe again. She was still shaking, but she could not stop. At last, Audrey got to the main hall. She stayed in a dark corner, behind a pillar, and looked out at the scene. 500 guests from high society sat in pews covered in red velvet. Politicians, powerful business owners, and underworld figures were all there. They were dressed in expensive clothes and sparkling jewelry to see the wedding of the century. Flowers were everywhere, candles glowed, and a symphony played soft music. At the front, before the altar, Nico Fontaine stood waiting. He wore a perfect black suit, his hair styled back, but his gray eyes were empty, like a man unknowingly walking to his own death. Audrey put a hand on the music box, hidden in her pocket. The letter and the USB were safe inside. The proof that could save him was still there. Now or never, she told herself. Just then, the wedding music began to play. The guests all stood and turned to the main doors. Veronica Sterling entered, stunning in a Vera Wang gown that cost $1 million. Its pure white train stretched for meters, covered in thousands of shining crystals. She wore a priceless lace veil and carried a bouquet of white roses. She looked like a queen arriving in her kingdom. Guests murmured with admiration. Cameras flashed. Veronica smiled, the victorious smile of a person who was about to have it all. She walked toward the altar, toward Nico, toward the bloody future she had planned. Audrey gripped the music box. It was time. Veronica Sterling stood next to Nico Fontaine, her gown glowing under the chandeliers. She offered him her hand, her smile as bright as a queen's. Nico took it, his face still blank, like a man in a dream. The priest stood at the altar, his deep voice filling the church. Today we gather here before God to witness the sacred union of Nico Fontaine and Veronica Sterling. Audrey stood in the corner of the church, her heart pounding. She knew time was running out. Once the vows were exchanged, once Nico said, "I do," it would be too late. Veronica would become Mrs. Fontaine, and Nico would be a victim in his own home. With no other choice, she began to move. She slipped through the crowded pews, pushing past guests who were focused on the altar. She was met with suspicious looks and annoyed whispers. "Who are you? Where are you going? Why are you pushing?" Audrey did not reply. She kept moving forward, her gaze fixed on Nico's shape at the front of the church. The closer she got, the more doubting looks she received. Some of the guards started to notice the strange maid acting so strangely. The priest's voice carried on. The priest's words hung in the silent cathedral. Just as Nico Fontaine was about to answer, a single word shattered the peace. "Stop!" The shout echoed off the stone arches. Every one of the 500 guests turned to see a lone maid in the aisle. It was Audrey. Veronica's face drained of color. She knew that girl. The servant she had fired, the one who was supposed to be gone forever. But here she was, ruining everything. Without hesitating, Audrey sprinted toward the altar, her cheap shoes slapping against the polished marble. Guards moved to intercept her, but she was a blur of motion. She reached Nico and seized his arm, her desperate eyes locking with his. A raw, frantic plea. "Mr. Fontaine, please listen. She will kill you, just like she killed Kate." Nico's cold composure fractured. For the first time, shock registered on his face. Veronica's voice ripped through the air. "Security! Get this crazy woman out of here! She is completely insane!" The guards closed in, their large hands reaching for Audrey, but she held on to Nico, her grip like iron, and screamed with all her remaining force. "Veronica murdered Kate. She will murder you too. I have proof." A total silence fell over the cathedral. The 500 guests were statues. Nico looked down at Audrey. He saw something in her gaze that was not madness. It was not delusion. It was a desperate sincerity, a fire he had never witnessed before. As the guards reached for her, Audrey pulled Nico with surprising force toward a side room. He did not know why he went, but some deep impulse guided his feet. The door to the coat room slammed shut, cutting them off from the pandemonium outside. Veronica's screams of rage and fear echoed through the cathedral. The guests broke into a panicked murmur. Guards hammered on the locked door, but inside, there was only the sound of two people breathing. Nico Fontaine, Chicago's most feared man, stood opposite Audrey Shaw, the servant he had dismissed. The air was thick with tension. Everything was about to change. The small room was dimly lit. The chaos outside faded to a dull roar. Audrey was gasping for air, her hand shaking, as she reached inside her uniform. Nico watched her, his expression a mask of cold fury. "You have 30 seconds, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. 30 seconds to talk before I let my men handle you. Give me one reason to trust a thief who I fired for snooping, a woman who just destroyed my wedding." Audrey met his glacial gaze without wavering. She had come this far. She would not fail now. "You do not have to believe me," she replied, her voice now steady. "You only have to believe, Kate." She presented a small wooden music box. It was intricately carved with roses, aged but beautiful. Nico froze. His cold expression shattered as his eyes widened in recognition. He knew this box. He had given it to Kate on their wedding day, a symbol of a love he thought was buried forever. His voice was hoarse. This was Kate's. "Where did you find it?" "Mrs. Patterson gave me the key," Audrey explained, placing it in his hands. "Kate left a message for you inside. She knew what was going to happen. She wanted you to have the truth." His hands trembled as he took it. These were hands that never shook, but now they could barely function. He lifted the lid, and a familiar, painful melody filled the air. It was Kate's favorite song, the one from their wedding 7 years ago. For a moment, the music paralyzed him, a ghost of a happier time. Then he saw the folded letter nestled beneath the velvet lining. He pulled it out. The handwriting was unmistakable. It was Kate's. He recognized the gentle slant, the small circles she used for dots. He had memorized the script from countless love notes. As he started to read, his entire world came crashing down. Every word was a knife in his chest. "Veronica is not who you think. I saw her with another man. Dr. Harris is giving me pills that make me weaker. I think they are poison." Nico's expression shifted from disbelief to agony, then to a burning, uncontrollable rage. His hand clenched, crumpling the delicate paper. Then something happened that no one would have believed possible. Tears streamed down his face. He had not cried in 2 years, not even at Kate's funeral. He had become a man made of ice. But now, the dam broke. "Kate," he choked out, his voice broken. "My love, I am so sorry." Audrey watched in silence, allowing him the moment. She took out a phone she had grabbed from a purse in the crowd. "There is more," she said quietly. Kate recorded them. Nico's trembling hands took the phone. He watched videos of Veronica with a scarred man, planning a future without him. He heard audio of Dr. Harris talking about Kate's medication. He saw loving messages between Veronica and the man, words she had never said to him. The weight of it all crushed him. He collapsed into a chair, his body shaking with the awful truth. For 2 years, he had shared a bed with his wife's murderer. He had been a fool. After a long moment, he got to his feet. He wiped his face, straightened his suit, and when he looked up, the grief in his eyes was gone. The sorrow was replaced by the lethal focus of a hunter. The empty man was gone, and in his place was a killer. He gave Audrey a brief, sharp nod of gratitude. "Thank you." Then he moved to the door and threw it open. Nico Fontaine emerged, his face a mask of stone, his eyes like sharpened steel. Audrey followed, her pulse pounding, but she knew her part was done. The cathedral was a sea of noise and confusion. Guards stood ready to grab her, but Nico ignored them completely. Veronica ran to him, her expression a perfect performance of relief. "Nico, darling, what did that awful girl say to you?" "Do not listen to her lies. She is just angry I fired her." Nico said nothing. He did not even look at her. He walked past her, directly to the altar, where the bewildered priest waited. Nico stood before the microphone and surveyed the 500 silent faces. Then he spoke, his voice clear and cold. "This wedding is over." The words cut through the tension like a blade. A heavy silence fell across the cathedral, lasting for 3 long seconds before the room erupted into a chaos of questions and shocked whispers. In the center of the aisle, Veronica stood completely still, her face the color of ash. Her perfect day had just become her worst nightmare. Model that his wedding was canceled. After everything she had done, after 2 years of careful planning, after murdering Kate and seducing Nico, after getting so close to her prize. "Nico!" Veronica shrieked, her voice high with panic. "What are you talking about? You cannot do this. We are about to be married. You cannot call it off in front of 500 guests." She rushed toward him and grabbed his arm, her blue eyes filling with tears. "My love, let me explain everything. That maid is a liar. She is trying to destroy us. Do not believe her. Believe me." Nico ripped his arm away from her touch. His gray eyes met hers, and the look in them made her freeze. The cold distance was gone. Now there was only a deep, raw hatred. "Explain what?" Nico's voice was dangerously low. "Explain how you killed my first wife. Or should you explain how you intend to kill me after we are married?" Veronica's face lost all its color. Her legs felt weak. "What are you saying?" Nico looked at Finn, who stood close by. "Call Detective Morrison," he ordered, his voice flat. "Tell him I have evidence related to the murder of Catherine Fontaine. I have video, audio recordings, and a letter from the victim. I want him here now." Veronica stared, her mouth open, her face a mask of disbelief. How could Nico possibly know? How could he have proof? Kate died 2 years ago. He had erased every single trace. No one could prove a thing. "And get in touch with the brothers," Nico said, his tone casual. "I need to know the location of the fox, Derek Lawson. I want it within the hour." Veronica flinched, as if she had been shocked. She stared at Nico in horror. "You know about Derek?" "I do now," Nico said, his voice colder than winter. "Kate told me everything. I have the video of you with your lover. I have the recording of Dr. Harris talking about the poison. I have the messages between you and the man you called baby. I have all of it." Veronica's head snapped toward Audrey, who was standing right next to Nico. In that moment, her beautiful mask shattered, her angelic face twisted into something evil. Her blue eyes blazed with hate, and her entire body trembled with rage. "You," Veronica screamed, the sound like a wounded beast. "You did this. You filthy little maid. I will kill you for this." She lunged at Audrey, her red nails aimed for Audrey's face. But Finn moved faster. The bodyguard caught her from behind, wrapping his arms around her. Veronica fought like a wild animal, her screams echoing through the hall. "Let me go. Let me go. I am Nico Fontaine's wife. I am the queen of this city. You cannot touch me. You are nothing." "You are a murderer about to pay for your crimes," Nico said, his voice terrifyingly cold. He looked at Finn. "Hold her here. The police will arrive in 10 minutes." 500 guests stood frozen, watching the unbelievable scene. Many were already recording with their phones. The wedding of the century had become the arrest of the century. Veronica Sterling, who had looked like a queen moments before, now screamed and fought against a guard's hold like a cornered animal. In the chaos, with all eyes on Nico, Veronica saw an opportunity. When Finn glanced away for a second, she tore herself free. She shoved another guard and ran toward the back exit of the church. Her million-dollar gown trailed behind her like a white burial shroud, its crystals scattering across the marble floor. She ignored the shouts and screams that followed her. A single thought consumed her mind. Run. Escape. The black limousine waited at the back entrance, ready to take the newlyweds to the reception. Veronica launched herself into the car and yelled at the driver. The airport. Go now. I will give you $1 million if you get me there in 30 minutes. The car sped away, leaving St. Patrick's Cathedral and her ruined life behind. In the back seat, Veronica's trembling hands opened her purse. Inside was a fake passport for Emily Carter, a large bundle of cash, and a burner phone. She had planned this escape long ago. This was her plan B. She ripped off her veil and her diamond tiara, then struggled in the small space to change out of the massive dress. She pulled on a simple black coat she had packed. The expensive jewels went into a small cloth bag. She tied her blonde hair back tightly. In the rear-view mirror, Veronica Sterling vanished. All that remained was an ordinary woman with a desperate face, running for her life. Just get on the plane, she whispered, trying to steady her breathing. Just get to Europe. Derek has people in Paris. I can start over there. The car screeched to a halt at O'Hare. Veronica jumped out, threw a stack of cash at the driver, and ran for the international terminal. She pushed through crowds of people, her eyes searching for any sign of trouble. She saw nothing. There were no guards, no police, just normal travelers with their luggage. She breathed a sigh of relief and went to the Air France counter. The flight to Paris left in 2 hours. She handed over the fake passport, her face a mask of calm. One first-class ticket to Paris, please, the earliest flight. The agent checked this passport, typed on the computer, and smiled. Of course, Miss Carter. One moment, please. Veronica stood there, her heart pounding. Her eyes scanned the terminal again and again. Get the ticket, get through security, get on the plane, then she would be safe. Where do you think you are going, Veronica? A familiar, cold voice spoke from behind her. Veronica froze. Her blood turned to ice. She slowly turned and faced her worst nightmare. Nico Fontaine stood there, still in his black wedding tuxedo, his gray eyes like chips of ice. Next to him were Finn O'Brien and a man she knew as Detective Morrison from the Chicago Police Department. Behind them, dozens of uniformed officers were blocking off the entire area. How? Veronica whispered, her face pale with shock. How did you find me? Did you forget? Nico said, walking toward her. Each step was like the toll of a bell. I own this city. My people are at every exit from Chicago. The airport, the train station, the bus terminals. Where did you think you could possibly go? Veronica backed away until she hit the counter. She forced a seductive smile, her voice turning sweet. Nico, my love, let me explain. It is not what you think. That maid lied about everything. I love you. I have always loved you. Be quiet, Nico snapped, his voice cutting like glass. I have Kate's letter. I have her recordings. I have a video of you and your lover planning to kill me. Dr. Harris confessed everything to the police 20 minutes ago. Your game is over, Veronica. The beautiful mask shattered. Her angelic face twisted into a demonic snarl of pure rage. So what? She screamed, her voice raw and ugly. Kate was weak. She was not good enough for you. She did not know how to hold on to a man. I am the one you need. I did everything for our future. There was never an us, Nico said, his voice flat and empty. There was only your greed. You do not love me. You love my fortune and my power. At that moment, Veronica saw Audrey standing behind Nico. It was the little maid with the green eyes who had destroyed 2 years of her work. Pure madness took over. Veronica lunged at Audrey like a wild beast, her fingernails clawing, a howl ripping from her throat. You. This is your fault. I would have had everything. I will kill you. I will tear you to pieces. Police officers swarmed forward, tackling Veronica and pinning her to the ground. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed as they closed around her wrists. They dragged her away, her face a mess of tears and makeup, her golden hair a tangled wreck. Her black coat was askew, her perfect nails now shattered. The queen had fallen, replaced by a criminal crying out as justice took hold. A crowd of phones recorded everything as Chicago's would-be mafia boss crumbled. "Nico!" Veronica shrieked as they forced her into a police car. "You will pay for this." Nico never turned. His voice was empty. "My only regret is not seeing the real you." 3 months later, the verdicts for Catherine Fontaine's murder were delivered. Veronica Sterling received a life sentence with no chance of parole. The judgment sent her into a rage, and officers had to physically remove her from the courtroom as she screamed her vile threats. Dr. Warren Harris was given 15 years for his part in the crime, his face pale as the cuffs closed around his wrists. Derek Lawson, known as the Fox, was finally caught in a joint raid. He faced charges for everything from murder to trafficking. The city was captivated by what the papers called the bloody wedding case. It was a tale of betrayal and justice. But at the center of it was a quiet hero, Audrey Shaw, the 28-year-old maid who risked everything to expose the truth. News outlets chased her for interviews, and podcasts wanted her story, but Audrey turned them all down. She had no desire for fame. She craved a simple life, away from the chaos of the wealthy. During her regular visit to see Tommy at the hospital, she prepared to ask about the mounting surgery bills, but the doctor met her with a wide smile. "Miss Shaw, your brother's surgery is scheduled. It has been completely paid for." Audrey froze, certain she misunderstood. $200,000? Who paid it? The doctor's smile was mysterious. An anonymous donor who wishes to remain private. Audrey knew at once. Only one man had that kind of power and a reason to help. Tears of relief streamed down her face. The operation was a perfect success, and Tommy's recovery was remarkable. A strong, new heart now beat inside the 16-year-old. For the first time ever, Tommy could run and play. Audrey hugged him, crying with joy. "You're going to be fine," she whispered. Across town, Nico Fontaine was also starting over. He established a charity called Kate's Hope Foundation to help victims of abuse. He gave 80% of his wealth to it and passed control of his businesses to Finn. His friend was stunned. "Are you serious? You spent 2 decades building this." Nico stared out the window, his gaze peaceful. "I have spent enough time in the dark, Finn. It is time to find the light, just as Kate always wanted." Later, Nico visited Kate's grave. He placed her favorite white roses on the headstone. "I am sorry I failed you," he said, his voice heavy. "I was blind, but now the person who hurt you is gone. I met someone else, Kate. She has your courage and your kindness. She saved me." A soft breeze rustled the petals, and for the first time in years, Nico smiled. It felt like an answer. 6 months passed. Audrey and Tommy's world was transformed. They lived in a lovely suburban house with a flower garden and a white picket fence. It was not a grand estate, but it was a true home. A place filled with laughter. Tommy, full of life, played outside with other kids. The 16-year-old could finally be a normal boy. In the garden, Audrey tended her roses, her hands covered in dirt. A calm, genuine smile graced her face, something she once thought impossible. An engine rumbled down the quiet street. An old green Jeep, not a luxury car, pulled up to her gate. Nico Fontaine got out, but he was a different man. There was no expensive suit, just a simple white shirt with the sleeves rolled up. He wore simple pants and sneakers. His face looked healthy, and his gray eyes, once so cold, now held a gentle warmth. "Uncle Nico!" Tommy yelled, running to embrace him. Nico laughed and tousled the boy's hair. "How's that new heart?" "It's awesome," Tommy beamed. "I'm the fastest kid at school. Can we play catch?" "Soon," Nico promised. "I need to speak with your sister." As Tommy rejoined his friends, Audrey walked out of the garden, wiping her hands on her apron. Her heart began to race, and she felt a sudden, unfamiliar nervousness. A quiet moment passed between them. They had survived killers and conspiracies, but now simple words were hard to find. Finally, Nico spoke. "I have been thinking about us." "Us?" Audrey asked, surprised. "You saved my life," he said, looking directly at her. "Not just from Veronica, but from the darkness inside me. You gave me a reason to become someone better." He took a breath. "I am opening a center for families in need. I'm calling it Hope House." "That's incredible," Audrey said. "I need a person to manage it," Nico continued. "Someone who understands struggle. Someone with courage. Someone like you." "Me?" she stammered. "But I'm nobody special." He moved closer and took her hand. "You're the bravest woman I know, Audrey." His voice softened. "I hope you will give me a chance to know you, not as a boss, but just as Nico." Audrey looked into his warm eyes and smiled. "I would like that." "Are you guys gonna play or not?" Tommy shouted from across the lawn. They both laughed, and hand in hand, they went to join him. The setting sun bathed the garden in light as their laughter filled the air. They had a simple home, quiet days, and a new love. Audrey had done the right thing for no reward, and Nico discovered that true strength was not about power. It was about having the courage to start over. Our heroes do not always come from wealth. Sometimes they are the quiet people who do what is right. This story shows that bravery comes from the heart, not the wallet. One person's choice can change everything. And real love is not about perfection, but about sincerity and sacrifice. We thank you for listening to our story. How did it make you feel? Have you ever known a person like Audrey? Please share your thoughts with us in the comments. If you liked this video, we ask that you subscribe, like, and share it with your friends. This helps us bring you more stories like this one. We wish all of you watching good health, happiness, and peace. Thank you for your time, and we will see you in our next story. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful lessons and inspiration to our audience.